just in terms of like, I did want to talk about this story. Just this is a story I bring up because I think it provides an interesting psychological insight into the preening cretins and psychopaths who are prosecuting this war, at least as far as the American government is concerned. This is from the Wall Street Journal. The hottest and most exclusive MAGA status symbol is a pair of leather Oxfords. And it says here, prefer a wingtip loafer or monk strap, black or brown? President Trump's got you. Trump has been gifting footwear to agency heads, and lawmakers, White House advisors, and VIPs. Did you get the shoes? He asked at cabinet meetings. Some people have laced up in the Oval Office. During a lunch meeting in January, Trump suddenly pivoted to his incredible new shoes and gave Tucker Carlson a pair of brown wingtips. All the boys have them, said a female White House official. Another joked, it's hysterical because everyone's afraid not to wear them. The shoe salesman in chief is paying attention. Trump has fallen in love with Florsheim, the American brand that's been pairing comfort and style for more than a century. They are also affordable. Many cost $145. The president has taken to guessing people's shoe size in front of them. He asks an aide to put in an order, and a week later, a brown Florsheim box arrives at the White House. Trump sometimes signs the box or attaches notes of gratitude, according to people familiar with the ritual. Now, this has been paired with some photojournalism over the last couple of days that shows Marco Rubio clumping around in a pair of shoes clearly several sizes too big for him. You know, like when you used to like put on your dad's shoes as a kid and try to walk around the house like that. That's what little Marco is looking like right now. And there's a couple of other photos of White House people wearing the Florsheim Oxford, but like you could like see like their foot is coming out of the top of the shoe, like, you know, bread being baked in an oven, like incredibly way too tight for them. And then, I bring, there's another story today about Pete Hegseth banning journalists from the Pentagon press pool for taking, quote, unflattering photos of him. And I guess I bring this up because, like, in light of the double tap on the girls' school and just like their general way that they've branded and sold this war as like a new era of American warrior ethos, these fucking morons are going around like they're too afraid not to wear shoes that their boss got them and are mad that an unflattering photo, like, you think, like, would General Patton care that he looked a little bit less butch than he wanted to do?
Yes.
Yeah, well, yes. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, like, this is, to be fair, how, like, most of the most accomplished military leaders of, you know, let's just say, since the Renaissance conducted themselves, but they also match that with competence. But they've just gotten, like, the fruitiness and the niece fucking of Patton and MacArthur without any of
being dressed like a girl until your 8th birthday, you know.
Yeah. But none of the stuff that comes with that.
Yeah, I'm like, I don't know. It's just like it's this, you know, surreal and absurd fact of reality. Is like these are the people in charge, and I guess, Marlon, I wanted to ask you about like how this relates, because, you know, you've been covering how like the Epstein network is currently like being investigated in France, and Jeffrey Epstein's ties to, like, you know, French modeling agencies, for instance, and this kind of like wholesale operation of importing women as models under the guise of modeling contracts to essentially be part of, you know, the Epstein network of human trafficking and blackmail. But like, now that, like, I feel like for like in the weeks leading up to the Iran war, people kept saying over and over again that like Trump's going to go to war with Iran to distract from the Epstein files, and like that argument is right there waiting to be made. But I guess I'm wondering, from your perspective, do you think that that's like a fair argument to make? Do you think that like we are at war now with Iran as a distraction from the Epstein files, or is this like, are we at war with Iran because of like the people and networks of power that the Epstein files seem to, like, articulate?
Yeah, I mean, it's like a long-standing goal of, you know, America and Israel to invade Iran. I don't know if the timing is opportunistic. I don't really think so. You know, there were many occasions when stuff came out, and I don't think it, you know, there's always the thing people post. It's like the picture of the search interest and the Epstein files going down since the war started. I don't know if it really will. It's like, it's reached such a tipping point with how much people are interested in the case, with all this stuff that's come out, and there keep being investigations produced into it. As much as has come out in these files, like the emails and photographs themselves are wild, but even more interesting is sort of like the breadcrumbs it leads you to go on these investigations. And like Le Monde came out with an incredible story today about sort of the network in Paris, and Mediapart, another French organization, is coming out with stuff. So I would say like maybe it's more the latter, like the network that's represented in these Epstein files, just this ruling class that like operates with impunity is the sort of the same ruling class that is prosecuting the war, in the sense that they have their agendas and, you know, their priorities, which is, you know, to destroy, you know, any resistance to American imperialism. It all sort of overlaps, but I don't think it's like a one-on-one, this is
Yeah.
happening because of this. It's some of the same people, you know, or the same
Yeah.
types of people, in the sense of like rich capitalists, imperialists, you know?
Yeah. Like I would never discount entirely that there is some motivation in terms of, getting the media's attention off the Epstein files if you are Donald Trump. But like, I think that's a minor consideration in what, as you laid it out, is like, I don't know, a decades long plot or plan or a decades long, I don't know,
Priority.
priority, yeah, to get someone in the White House as fundamentally stupid and compromised as Donald Trump to do exactly this, which is to start a war with Iran, which has been, this is the crown jewel of these people for going on decades now, right?
Yeah, it's like the realization of all their wildest dreams. You know, you saw Hillary Clinton even talking about how happy she was with Trump this term.
That's insane to me. Like that she said that Trump was getting better in his second term. I mean, I thought it would be like universally acknowledged, certainly among Democrats, that Trump's second term in office is markedly worse and more evil than his first one. So that's bizarre to me. But or not bizarre, because you're right. This has been a long dream of Hillary Clinton as well, is war with Iran. It's just like, but like as far as France and European governments go, specifically, like how is the French public and media reacting to the many threads connecting Jeffrey Epstein to people and institutions in French politics and sort of business, and also like the world of these shady modeling agencies, like Jean-Luc Brunel, who was like another conspirator who also ended up dead in a jail cell, shall we say, very recently.
Yeah, I think like for a long time, and still a little bit, but it's breaking a little, there's been sort of an omerta in the French press. There was a bunch of stories published after he was arrested in 2019 into his network, into Jean-Luc Brunel, places like Mediapart or 20 Minutes. They like contacted victims and lawyers, and some testified about, terrible things happening to them, like being drugged and date raped by people like Jean-Luc Brunel. There being parties at like his Paris apartment. And then it kind of went dead after Brunel was arrested. Well, Epstein died. Brunel was arrested. Then Brunel died
under basically identical circumstances.
Yeah, in prison, they're doing their rounds one night and they look through the peephole and there he is, hanged. Even though was hanged before, his lawyers said he was suicidal, that he should be on suicide watch. His lawyers actually have called for like a new investigation, because there was supposed to be a prison investigation by something called the Third Judicial Police. It's just like an agency into his death. And for years now, I think honestly for years, like at least the past 2 years, I've been trying to contact people in the Ministry of Justice, or the various departments, of like, does this report exist? What's the state of it? And there's no answer. And recently I got in touch with Brunel's lawyers, who probably have their own, agenda. They're trying to portray it as like the government was negligent, and let their client die. And they said that they haven't heard from the government since 2024, because they called for a new investigation. They claim that they saw an autopsy and he definitely killed himself, for what it's worth. But either way, he was either they either let him kill himself, which is criminally negligent in and of itself.
Yeah, I mean, like that's the thing when we talk about the death of Jeffrey Epstein or Brunel. It's like if you take at face value that they both committed suicide in prison and that they weren't murdered, which is like, I think what a lot of people assume, that still represents a shocking breach of protocol for like two very high value witnesses being held in federal custody to be put in a situation where they could conceivably hang themselves in a prison cell. Like that is a huge glaring fuck up that is such a bad fuck up. It would seem to imply something a little bit more intentional.
Yeah, there's a specific protocol in this prison, which is called La Santé, it's in Paris, in the middle of Paris, where you put people on suicide watch with only paper blankets, paper clothes, etc. And he was not put on it. But so anyway, this all happened and it sort of died down. There hasn't been a lot of reporting on the case for maybe 3 years, and then these new files started being released. I wrote about them a little in November and December because there was some big stuff in even those files. The biggest one, and I'll jump all around my outline right now of what I wanted to talk about, but the biggest one I think, is that, Epstein and Bannon were texting a lot. Bannon was spending a lot of time in France in 2019, meeting with like Marine Le Pen's party, also in Italy with Matteo Salvini and the Italian fascist parties. And Epstein texts Bannon on March 29th, 2019, says, "I'm in the Elysee, online again in 45 minutes. The Elysee is the presidential palace, Apparently, Epstein says he was there, and he was in Paris those days, and he was at like some 30th anniversary celebration for the pyramids at the Louvre. He was invited by Jack Lang, the former culture minister, who has since resigned with these new files coming out. But I tried, of course, to contact the Elysee through official channels and then through, like people who work for the government. Radio silence from them. Only one other media organization that I know of has publicly reported trying to get in touch with the Elysee about this, and that's Valor Actuel, which is like this fascist magazine. They talked to some people off the record in like Macron's, and they claim that they checked the records and there's no record of him ever being in the Elysee. But of course, that's not an official check of the records. So even in like November, December, when the files started initially coming out, there wasn't much in the French press. And then over the past, when those 3 million files came out, there's been a ton of actually reporting on it, and some really good reporting on it, because Paris was big for Epstein. Epstein spent a lot of time in Paris.
He had an apartment there as well. We saw photos.
Yeah,
of the
22 Avenue Foch, which is right next to the right next to the Arc de Triomphe. It's a really nice area. He had the whole second floor. He would go for 15 days every 2 months. And there's this great investigator. He's an academic. His name's Thomas Volshow, and he does a lot of public records requests into Epstein. And he found that after Epstein's conviction after Epstein was jailed in 2008, 2009, convicted and jailed in America, he started spending a lot more time in France, because France has a lower age of consent. The age of consent is technically only 15 in France, except there's exceptions, but, and that's only very recently that it was like sort of actually made a legal like red line. So yeah, Paris is super important to Epstein. He has tons of business connections. He was great friends with Ariane de Rothschild, who was the head of the Edmond de Rothschild Group, one of the big banking groups in France. Not the one Macron worked for. He worked for Rothschilds and Co. He was good friends with Jack Lang, this culture minister. He was good friends with a guy named Olivier Colomb, who was a senior diplomatic advisor to Nicolas Sarkozy, who was president before from 2007 to 2012. Colomb has also now supposedly an advisor to Marine Le Pen, and him and Colomb were exchanging texts, like talking about Epstein said, "Oh, I'm at my island with an aquarium of girls," and they're like emailing back and forth with these sort of nautical or seafood metaphors about which girls they like, referring to great white sharks or black shrimp. Epstein says he hates black shrimp.
Oh, Jesus.
And yeah. And so that's Colomb. I don't know. And I could I could roll out in a million different directions on it. But yeah, there's so much there.
Yeah, but what does this imply about what he was up to in France? Because it seems to be like part and parcel of what he was up to everywhere in the world, which is, like you said, he met with Le Pen's party. Like, it seemed like him and Bannon were very interested in cultivating a kind of resurgence of, I don't know, European right-wing nationalist parties. Is that fair to say?
That's what him and Bannon are talking about. It's always hard to tell, like, Epstein's narrative. He seemed to sort of have his pot in every pie, of course. One thing that he texts Bannon around the same time, which is super interesting, is he goes, "Oh yeah, Bill de Blasio is going to run for mayor. Isn't it good to know?" So he somehow had an inside line that de Blasio was going to run, or that de Blasio was going to run for president, because that was before the 2020 election. So it's sort of hard to tell what he was doing politically with the National Rally. it seems more like he was maybe cultivating Bannon, and he's like, he agrees with everyone that he talks to, and he, makes jokes about like brown shirts, and at the same time he's like organizing dinners in Paris with Bannon, Jack Lang, and Chomsky, and he tries to get Jack Lang to host him and Bannon, or he tries to interest Bannon in coming to get dinner with Jack Lang by saying, "Oh yeah, he's like Chomsky, but he actually knows his facts," which is kind of interesting. He kind of implies that Chomsky is a dunce in those messages. But he was also cultivating power, like, so he's also friends with this guy named Fabrice Aidin, and Aidin was, part of the French foreign ministry, but he was a UN diplomat, basically. He was a deputy in the United Nations for Terje Rod Larson, when Rod Larson was the Secretary General Special Envoy. I think over at Trunon, they did a good episode on Terje. I haven't dug into him a lot, but he was apparently very powerful at the UN, Terje. And him and Epstein, or Fabrice Aidin and Epstein, seemed to sort of be like a go-between. They were cultivating networks with Gulf monarchs and mobility. Aidin worked at the UN from 2006 to 2013. And the reason why he stopped working there is because there was an FBI investigation into him for visits to child pornography sites. They produced a 200-page report with text messages, internet records, etc. They set up a sting against him. They posed as a man offering his son to Aidin at a Washington hotel. Aidin didn't bite at the sting, but he got wind that the FBI were looking into him. And they initially didn't arrest him because basically they thought it should be like, oh, we should go through the French embassy. And so Gerard Araud, who was he was France's UN rep at the time, claims that he consulted the file and in the office of Ban Ki-moon's chief of staff, and he remembered, oh yeah, it says that he has repeatedly accessed child pornography sites, but never committed any acts. He said that Araud said he called Paris and said that they should prepare psychological treatment for him as well as disciplinary sanctions, not fire him, of course.
That still keeps you above 600 on your credit report.
Exactly, yeah. They slightly downgrade your pension. And so it's hard to say what's true exactly, because Aidin supposedly fled New York. He drove to Canada and got a flight. And this all sort of connects back to Epstein, because when he gets back to France in 2014, he takes a job at the Edmond de Rothschild Group, which at the time was de facto being run by Ariane de Rothschild, who was this close personal friend of Epstein's. And Epstein was handling a lot of things for them. He helped them manage an FBI investigation into Swiss banking, supposedly through Kathy Rumler, who was, Obama's, she was deputy AG at the time, and she quit 1 month before she helped Edmond de Rothschild basically cut in half their fine. They were looking at $80 million. They paid $45 million through Epstein. Epstein helped them handle some Malaysian sovereign wealth fund business they were involved in, where $4 billion worth of funds were involved, and they might have got burned by it. So yeah, this guy Aidin, who's in powerful French diplomatic circles, comes back and takes a job at what is not, it's not legally Epstein's bank, but he was almost running it with Ariane at the time.
So I think what emerges here is a picture of a guy who is sort of, I don't know, not very ideologically committed to one political point of view so much as he is committed to being a kind of, I don't know, a fixer or a conduit for elite wealth, like the Rothschilds, Les Wexner, Glenn Dubin. I mean, go down the list. He's a money manager for these various billionaires. He works with Kathy Rumler to cut in half, as you mentioned, a fine levied against the Rothschild banks. But underneath all of this does seem to be that literally is the pimping and trafficking of women, many of whom from Eastern Europe and many of whom are underage. And I want to bring this up in light of the fact that as this becomes more obvious and as more high profile names in the United States and Europe of very wealthy, powerful people are associated with this project in these emails, there does seem to me to be the kind of creation of an anti-Epstein narrative and agenda by certain journalists. And, I'll bring him up, Michael Tracy, because I've seen you interact with him. And Michael Tracy seems to be the most, vociferous or prominent of this kind of anti-Epstein narrative. And I guess I'm asking you because like I've seen you argue with him, and you're someone who has followed this case very closely. I guess I'm just wondering, like, what is the narrative that is being offered here? And not so like, is it a defense of Jeffrey Epstein, or is it a defense of like, like guilt, or a condemnation of guilt by association? Because like the varying things of what I've seen is the idea that like Epstein committed no sexual crimes, like all his victims were of age. It was all consensual. He only pimped women to himself and no one else, or that also he's not a pimp at all. And there's like, there's no prostitution involved in any of this. Like, I just hard to keep track, but like to me, it just does seem like an effort to just bald-facedly state and like resurrect or sort of protect the reputations of all these very wealthy and powerful people who had connections with a guy who was, a convicted pimp.
Yeah. The most sort of charitable reading of the argument, and I'm not charitable to his argument, but the most charitable reading of his argument is that it's overblown, the story. That, yes, Epstein, he always puts it in this way, like he showed poor judgment in associating with these girls, but they all lied to him in Palm Beach. They claimed they were 18. They gave him, sexualized massages. But it's basically a plot by the lawyers and these women to extract money from him that sort of turned into another thing, which is this huge alt media like bonanza. And there's like some truth to that second part, which is not the one he emphasizes. Like there is an Epstein industry, and there is like ludicrous nonsense always being said, based on files and stuff. But there's a lot of that stuff is believable because there is so much ludicrous reality to the case. But yeah, like he says it's the lawyers who basically extorted Epstein, and now there's like a media feeding frenzy because it's the biggest story in the world, and how can you avoid talking about it for clicks?
Going by that explanation, does he ever offer an explanation for like why Epstein was picked? If this is always just like a conspiracy by the lawyers to frame this guy, like in conjunction with the victims?
Yeah, I'm not sure if he's going to get to this point, but I think I know which way he's going to go, because when you like dig into all these civil cases, and I first came across the case back in I think 2015. I was listening to Pierce Redmond's podcast, Porkins Policy Radio, which was excellent. He was really covering all these civil cases, and Epstein and the lawyers and the victims, they were suing each other back and forth for like defamation and stuff. And Epstein at one point claimed that, and this is true, there was a lawyer in Florida named Scott Rothstein who basically was using settlements with Epstein as like investment vehicles as part of a Ponzi scheme. And he was convicted. So basically he was like pretending to sell these in settlements with Epstein to people as part of a Ponzi scheme, which is kind of like weird and complex. And Bradley Edwards, who was one of these main lawyers who represented a lot of the women in these civil cases, did briefly work at Rothstein's law firm. So Epstein makes these arguments himself in a lot of the civil cases against like the lawyers, that he was chosen because, there was this sleazy Palm Beach lawyer who wanted to extract money from him.
Yeah, I guess that still doesn't really explain it though. What I mean is like, okay, if it was just, if these are totally fictitious and all these encounters were consensual, like Jeffrey Epstein was not an obscure figure, but at the time of the infamous sweetheart deal, it's not like he was nationally known. And you'd further, if you were going to like do something this fucking risky, that if caught, you would probably get disbarred against someone with a lot of resources, nonetheless, which, by the way, if there was this conspiracy, you would figure like it wouldn't have even gotten to the sweetheart deal point. Like he had good enough representation that they probably could have just like gotten this thrown out if this really was the case.
Yeah.
But even then, like if you were just like going to do this is all fictitious, and again, like adult women consensually massaging, whatever, wouldn't you want to go for like a guy who was more well known, B, who you knew for a fact had like billions of dollars, which Epstein at least controlled billions of dollars, but just someone who like was on the Forbes 400, and maybe most importantly, who had like a family and not just whatever he was doing at Zoa Ranch, but like had a wife and kids who he was publicly associated with, and like presumably would not want something like that getting out. Like there would be way better targets for such a thing.
Well, like you said, the lawyers did handle it. Rothstein went to prison, but that didn't end the story. This happened a long time ago.
Right,
the story, went forward, not the story, but like the reality of it. I think it also, and I think the reason why it kept going forward is because, there were these, like all these, victims who stayed in civil court, and, people often dismiss them because they got huge settlements. They got millions of dollars, right? True. Some of them did get millions of dollars.
It's insane when people say that, because it's like, oh yeah, that proves that the defendant is innocent. They're willing to pay hundreds of millions of dollars to make this go away.
Well, I mean, like, I guess, like, in order to believe the anti-Epstein narrative, or that this is a hoax, that this is overblown, I think basically what you like, the essential fact that you have to believe in is that the conspiracy that exists here was a conspiracy perpetrated against Jeffrey Epstein, a guy with, Felix, like you said, connections to some of the most powerful lawyers in the world, connections to some of the richest people in the world, connections to the intelligence agencies of the United States and Israel, as well as other foreign countries, that like he was the victim of a conspiracy perpetrated against him. And the conspiracy was perpetrated by a group of teenage girls in Florida.
Yeah. Like, what wouldn't you, if you were just like a sleazebag lawyer, wouldn't you go, okay, Israeli intelligent asset, shadowy figure, not that well known, or like Brett Michaels? No, I think I'm going to go with the guy who will kill me.
Yeah, and it's like also important to remember the criminal case, against Ghislaine Maxwell. There were, at least 5 Jane Does. I was at the case, so I should remember that. But there were at least 5 Jane Does, not Jane Does. There were 5. Some of them testified under their names: Annie Farmer, Caroline. Others testified, synonymously. That case happened after the majority of the settlements were paid out, right? So these like women who testified in the case had no incentive to testify at this criminal trial. In fact, if they were lying and made it up, testifying under, cross-examination by the defense lawyers of Ghislaine Maxwell, who are excellent defense lawyers for what it's worth, you know what I mean? They make very convincing sounding arguments. They open themselves up to losing their money if they were only in it for the money, right? If they had been discredited, then the Epstein Victims Compensation Fund, which was this, mechanism set up after his death by the estate, which, you could also even criticize it for saying it protected the estate. They would have looked at their settlements and said, well, actually, you were shown to have perjured yourself and lied in court. So then why would these women testify in this criminal case? It just doesn't stand up under reason. Yeah.
Yeah. Like this argument, like it seems to hinge on the idea of like, this is all like he was at most guilty of being a rake, and all the scumbag lawyers in the world were allied against him. And this guy who, for the purposes of my defense, I will admit that he was kind of a sleazeball. None of his lawyers were scumbags. They were all Atticus Finch.
Yeah. To Kill a Mockingbird. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there was also this narrative that all the girls lied and said he was 18, which, but first of all, that's not, if a girl lies to
you're
you and
still
says
on the
they're
hook
18.
for that. If someone lies to you and says they're 18, and first of all, they say, oh, don't worry, I'm just 18, and you're a man in his 40s or 50s. That's already pretty fucking dicey. But let's say they lied to you and like, oh shit, I thought she was 18. Like, I mean, aren't you at least still morally culpable for that shit? Especially if you were like pimping them for money.
And that's the other part of their narrative that he may have like abused them himself, but he was never lending them out to anybody. There was no trafficking. But on that exact subject, they all said they were 18. There was a story that came out in Le Monde today about the police search of Epstein's house in 2019. And it's just like, they have all these photographs, which you mentioned earlier, really unsettling stuff. There's like a Black Lodge feel to it. Like, and almost like he meant there to be a Black Lodge feel to it. Like he picked in one room, there's a 5.5-foot statue of an African warrior, a miniature zebra, a stuffed monkey, a framed tarantula, an armchair covered in tiger skin. And on one shelf, there's a saw shark's nasal bone. But so they find all this weird stuff, and the pictures are weird. But also, they find hundreds of nude photos of girls from the ages of 15 to 20 hanging on walls and frames on tables. And they find a CD-ROM with an Excel file on it. And the Excel file lists 62 women. And in the categories, and also they say in the story, including minors under the age of 15. Included in the Excel file are lists of sex acts like penetration or oral, as well as age at time, O/U. O meaning overage and U meaning underage. So the idea that you can defend,
Jesus
he knew.
Christ, yeah.
He knew and he meant it, obviously.
It's incredibly well documented. I think the only people who should engage with this sort of anti-Epstein bullshit are people like you who have physically attended these trials and have a deep background of knowledge on this and instant recall. Otherwise, I've chosen not to because I don't have nearly the level of command that you have with it. And also it's just there's something fundamentally so just depressing about it. I mean, using this as just a career move, I guess, because there've always been cynics and assholes and people who knowingly say or do amoral things in media and independent media, but it's just there's no angle to this other than oh, this will drive a lot of engagement. It's just one of the most hollow things. And I don't know how much he believes it, because this is so well documented. To believe that that there is any degree of innocence here, it would, I mean, like you said, it would be a conspiracy against Jeffrey Epstein. And why?
Yeah, I think for what it's worth, because like you said, the case or they're so complex, and you can find good arguments in any direction because the arguments were made by some of the best lawyers in the world. Because I've read a lot of these civil cases and the criminal case, and I read a lot of the filings, I recognize in sort of the anti argument a lot of the defense arguments, explicitly. I don't mean oh, they remind me. A lot of these arguments are the arguments that Epstein or Maxwell's defense lawyers made.
Right. And certainly they're entitled to a legal defense, and a vigorous one at that. But I'm not his attorney. In fact, I'm not even in court at all. I'm just looking at this story as, a private citizen, and I'm under no obligation to I'm under no obligation to take his legal defense as as fact, when everything I can see just on its face implies exactly what we all think it does. That this guy was a international pimp and criminal who was raping and abusing women on at the both personally and at the behest of some very powerful people for decades.
Yeah, and for what it's worth, a jury didn't buy the defense arguments. The civil cases have mostly all been settled. None of these arguments have ever carried water.
Marlon, when we started talking about this, you mentioned that this story, obviously because of its nature, has been kind of a bonanza for a lot of independent or alternative media. And we've talked about on the show before, it's kind of offensive given how how unpleasant and how horrible this case is, that there does seem to be kind of a gold rush because of how, I don't know, salacious the details of the story are. But I guess from your perspective, for someone who's just interested in this story, or following the news on social media, or trying to find independent sources of information that confirm things that seem to be common sense, or seem to seem to confirm the wider implications of what we all think is manifest in this case. What would you suggest to people in terms of being able to separate the real from people who are just sort of using it to advance their brand and to make money, whether it be contrarian takes against the prevailing narrative, or people who sensationalize elements of this case, in ways that are obviously, that will discredit the wider serious case being made, or are just sort of inauthentic in their obvious attempts to kind of merchandise this horrible story?
I guess the answer to that would be kind of a school mom scolding about facts and ethics, in the sense that just you really, I don't know, see if it's true. Like, it sounds stupid, but like if you hear something, just check if it's actually true. And if you can figure out if it's true, it is hard because it's like a complex case, and there are a lot of bad things, in this case, and a lot of things that just seem like shocking and not like, like unsettling, but just see if it's true. I mean, obviously there's some like great journalists, like there's a great French journalist named Mark Endewald who's been writing about this, and I always recommend him. I translated one of his pieces to English recently, so like he has really good reporting on it. There's, I don't know, even there are, plenty of mainstream reporters doing really good journalism on it. Like Jacob Shamsian at Business Insider is pretty good on the case. Like Matthew Goldstein at the New York Times, he does a lot of great business stories about the case. Like there's plenty of good people, outside of the mainstream too. But, I would just check, just check. Like if you're going to go down a rabbit hole, go down a rabbit hole. When I went down like a rabbit hole on this stuff back in 2015, because I saw all these powerful people connected to it. And, a lot of those instances, a lot of these powerful people I thought were connected to it are connected to it. But I went and I read the court filings, because I was listening to that great show, Porkins Policy Radio, and he would link to the court filings and like, oh yeah, this is true. These are the claims being made, So yeah, go actually read the emails. If you hear someone say something that's in the email, look at the number. There's a number called an EFTA number. Sometimes people crop them out, but like, if there is one, go put that into the Justice Department site and see if that's what the email says and read through it.
Following this case as long as you have, and now with like the additional confirmation of millions and millions of these emails, if someone asked you, why is this case important? Or what does this really matter other than like one guy's like dirty, evil deeds or whatever? Like what is so important about these emails or about this case that like is like if to make the case that like this is something more than just purient interest, that like this matters in terms of like geopolitics or culturally or anything? Like what do you say is like the large, like, the easiest case to be made for like why this is important and what it portrays about the society we live in?
Yeah, like I said, I was always kind of like interested in the case from the get-go because I thought it proved something just so obvious. It was right before the 2016 election, and it was like, you always say these people are all the same, right? Clinton and Trump are the same. And then here was like this thing that was like, oh yeah, they are the same. They move in the same circles. They turn the same blind eye to like the things that rich people do with impunity. All these, you would read about like when after his conviction, he would go straight back to New York and to these society parties. Everyone turned a blind eye to it. So for me, it was always like, yeah, it was just proof that the ruling class, right, are as bad as you think they are. Now, like the sensationalism aside, you don't need to think like even the minimalist position of what Epstein has done is like, it's terrible. He's raped children and women. And the people associated with him, they did not care. They didn't care because I think like in those circles of power and when you have enough money, people turn a blind eye to everything. And, it's not even like just with the Epstein case. It's true. We were talking before about like the anti people. And I think part of it was like, I think part of their argument is like, it's the ultimate backlash to Me Too. Like Epstein is the ultimate guy. They've already defended Weinstein. Candace Owens interviews Harvey Weinstein
right
sympathetically. So how much further can they go? And it's Epstein because the stories, well, I think it started circulating in conspiracy circles around 2016, around the same time, as Me Too came out. And so that was just sort of it for me that like, yeah, these rich, powerful people operate with impunity. I mean, it doesn't hurt that their sort of politics they represent aren't politics that I agree with. It's this sort of ruling class, council and foreign relations, global capitalist class that controls the world in banal ways and like fantastic ways,
Even taking it at face value, it is, the version of events that people like Glenn Dubin and Peter Thiel have gone with, it is due to a lapse in judgment that spanned over 15 to 25 years. I thought that this guy's tax advice was worth the association with this guy who raped countless women and girls. And whoops. That these incredibly wealthy people who, again, surrounded by the highest caliber of accountants, tax attorneys, whatever. In most cases, people who were titans in the financial industry themselves, that this guy, it just, the tax advice was too good. And I just had to overlook it. And I'm sorry, can we please stop talking about it?
Well, I think that argument was given voice recently. I saw that guy, Michael Schellenberger, was on Rogan this week, and him and Rogan got in a fight over like whether he thought Epstein had killed himself or not. And Schellenberger, of course, is one of these like San Francisco like new liberals who like as you know like made advocacy like against like the left and pro Silicon Valley. I mean, he's funded by like all these Silicon Valley guys, probably Peter Thiel specifically, who of course is thick as thieves with Epstein all over these fucking emails. And the argument he made to Rogan was that it's not fair because it's engaging in guilt by association when like just because someone's names are in these emails and they're still talking to Jeffrey Epstein, it's like, well, yeah, of course that doesn't imply that they were like raping teenage girls with him. But like to me, the broader argument is like all these contacts and these social relations between these powerful men and Jeffrey Epstein, even if they had nothing to do personally with like trafficking girls or like, you know, pimping or sexual abuse and rape. The fact of the matter is that they all continued their association with him after he had already been convicted of, at the very least, soliciting a minor for the purposes of prostitution, which is like, if you still want to be friends with someone like that after they've been convicted of that crime, doesn't that speak to your character? And more broadly than that, if you're talking about guys like Larry Summers, it speaks to them because they are constantly cajoling, lecturing, and demanding of everyone else that we follow and adhere to their morality. And when they scold people about, for instance, protesting against Israel on Harvard campus, that we should defer to their moral judgment when they have failed a very basic test of human morality in terms of their personal associations, even if you believe it's all above board. And they just simply were, Jeffrey was just too good a guy to turn their back on, despite the fact that he was like, you know, at the very basic level was, you know, a sex criminal.
Yeah. And you know, you said like they think it's worth it, and it was worth it to them. You know, there's this guy, Axel Dumas, he is the CEO of Hermes. And it's been so weird seeing that the Hermes stuff come out because there's been this social media narrative, which is huge, that like Hermes was they were the only people who turned down money from Epstein. And I mentioned that because like he initially denied having any involvement with Epstein. Of course, there was this investigation by Mark Endewald, which I really recommend. His like Substack is The Big Picture, but his like communications person said, "Oh no, we never met with him." But then these photos came out of Epstein with Woody Allen at the Hermes workshop in suburban Paris, a place called Pantin. And then they go, "Oh yeah, well, we didn't know he was going to come. Woody Allen brought him along." And then these emails, and we'll go through all these emails, and there's like tons of emails back and forth where Epstein is trying to get a meeting with Axel Dumas, and Axel Dumas's assistant is like enthusiastic about him, like, "Yeah, let's find a time. Let's look at our calendar." And it ended up falling through for like, you know, for scheduling reasons, actually, because he wanted to have Ehud Barak over for lunch with Dumas, and he was like using Ehud Barak, the former prime minister of Israel, as like the you know, like, "Oh, come meet Ehud Barak," but Ehud Barak didn't have time, so that's why it fell through. So it was worth it to all these people, and at every time they deny it, they deny, but more and more keeps coming out, and it's because, yeah, like you said, it's worth it to them, and they're just managing their reputations now about it. Like there was this, I saw a reel yesterday, and there was this about Hermes. Like they said the philanthropic arm of Hermes turned down money from Epstein, which they did in 2016. This reel had like 500,000 likes, and they were like, finally something good in the Epstein files. And it's bogus. You know, Axel Dumas probably wasn't involved with the philanthropic arm of Hermes. It was probably some other management. And Anne Mo, who is the like runs his communications agency, was seeding this idea when it came out. There were all these French journalists and influencers who started tweeting about this exact thing, you know, getting millions of like impressions. And a lot of them used to or did work for her communications agency. So yeah, I mean, it's worth it for them then, and it's worth it for them now to continue like paying these agencies to launder their reputation, because whatever they got from him was worth it. And with him specifically, there's like text between Bannon and Epstein where Epstein implies that he helped Axel Dumas fend off a takeover attempt from LVMH. Bernard Arnault, one of the richest men in the world. He says, "Oh, he had a good advisor in this text." So yeah, it was worth it for them.
I guess it's crazy that it's still worth it for them, because if all the people who you're facing the moral condemnation of the vast majority of the public at large, if everyone's pointing the finger at you, but it's you and Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, and the head of every fucking bank on the planet, apparently, you can weather that because you matter and they don't. And that to me, I think is the broader meta story here about why this is important is you said, for the ultra rich, they exist in a world without borders and without laws. And everything that you take for granted about your life or how you relate to your government or society at large, that's rules for little people like you. And that essentially these people have liberated themselves from humanity entirely, and that they can do, feel, and see, and they anything they want. There is nothing beyond their limits, nothing beyond their touch. And largely, even with the public embarrassment that comes along with this, that's still the case.
And you see it in French politics, even right now, it is so political because there was this recent controversy where Jean-Luc Mélenchon, he was at a meeting in Lyon, and he was joking around about how you pronounce Epstein's name. In French, you'd naturally pronounce a Stein name as Stein. That's how you usually pronounce Stein names.
This is what they got Jeremy Corbyn in trouble for.
Exactly.
Called him Epstein, yeah.
But most people pronounce his name in French as Epstein, which is actually the more Russian pronunciation. So he was joking, oh, he said Epstein. He goes, oh, no, I should say Epstein because that's more Russian. Sort of just commenting on this, all these stories that came out, oh, Epstein was a Russian agent. That was a big thing that was pushed in the French press also. He did have connections to people in the Russian government, and they were, he was recruiting models from there, and girls, not models, victims, really. So, and then this was a huge controversy in French politics. The Socialist Party has ruled out any combinations in the second round of the municipal elections with his party, LFI. The municipal elections are coming up. First round's on the 15th, second round's on the 22nd. They've all now said Mélenchon is the new Jean-Marie Le Pen. They've been calling him an anti-Semite for years and years and years, but they're really taking this moment to push that point. And Macron himself has said that he doesn't want there to be a public debate on Epstein. Epstein is it's an American thing. It's not something that we have to be concerned about. And so there's one deputy in the National Assembly, Antoine Léaumont. I interviewed him for Jacobin a couple of weeks ago, and they want a parliamentary commission of investigation into all this stuff because we got into some stuff, but I left out 20 stories. He was huge. He was hugely influential and present in France, and so what better way than a parliamentary commission to get to the bottom of it? But there's not going to be a parliamentary commission as of now because they can't get the votes. They don't have enough votes to open an investigative commission into Epstein right now.
So the attitude is that this is an American controversy, and also any investigation of it is also tainted by a kind of, I don't know, Dreyfus affair style anti-Semitism.
100%. No, they've said that explicitly. There's one guy in the Socialist Party who's an opponent of Mélenchon who said that it'll feed conspiracy theories. Jerome Gedge is his name. He said it'll feed conspiracy theories. Macron seems to have the same attitude. He's yeah, we're not having a public conversation about it.
I always think of one of my favorite moments in the Costa Gavras movie Z, when the right-wing Greek general is being taken out of court, and one of the people in the press say, General, do you feel like you're the new Dreyfus? And his response is, Dreyfus was guilty. But along those lines, the last thing I want to ask you is, there's been sort of the coinage of a new moniker, the Epstein class. And I see politicians like Ro Khanna have begun using the Epstein class as a kind of stand-in for the, elite impunity of wealth and power. And, quite frankly, a nexus of American and Israeli interests and influence over American government. Operation Epic Fury has been dubbed by some Operation Epstein Fury. And I've even seen spokespeople for the Iranian government describe this as a war being waged on them by the Epstein class, or by Jeffrey Epstein and people like him. Now, of course, like there was a piece in the Washington Post this week that sort of like not too subtly implied that this was all kind of anti-Semitic coding. And I guess what I want to ask you is like, do you think that the phrase Epstein class is useful in the mouths of politicians like Ro Khanna, or is this like, is this a bastardization that is sort of, I don't know, like, do you find this a useful, I don't know, moniker or sort of catchphrase, or is it just that, a catchphrase that obscures rather than reveals?
Yeah, I think it probably obscures more. I don't know, because like it's like sort of the difference. Like, is the global system bad because of Epstein, or is like Epstein bad because of he was facilitated by like the global system? You know, like there are many Epsteins. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Epstein was like the perfect storm in a teacup because because he was like linked to the two protagonists of the 2016 presidential election. That was part of it, and he was such a powerful, like wide-ranging figure. But he's not the cause. He's like he's the symptom, is what I would say. So I'm not like entirely opposed to the phrase. It's a cute little turn of phrase, but yeah, I think it does obscure a little.
Like, do we say Epstein class because we don't want to say, because what they're avoiding saying is the capitalist class?
Sure. Yeah, I think 100%.
And like that way Epstein becomes the kind of sin eater or kind of, Judas goat of what is essentially not the Epstein class or like a criminal class. What it is the capitalist ruling class of Europe and America.
Yeah, and 100%. Epstein class implies if you get rid of Epstein, that's
right,
it.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
Epstein is dead. I mean, I think Epstein is dead, but you know what I mean? Even if he's not dead, like
you don't
not
believe he's logging on Fortnite in Tel Aviv right now?
Maybe I haven't checked it out. There are some weird emails where they like talk about like after he died, some of his assistants are like saying, Jeffrey told me to send this. I haven't actually looked into those emails, this package, but
well, I mean, this is kind of the weird thing about all of this is that like a couple years ago, like things that I would have dismissed out of hand. I'm not saying I embrace every conspiracy theory or just believe everything I see, but like I wouldn't dismiss out of hand just about anything related to this guy and this case.
No, but yeah, it's like it is about him because he does seem to have been a very evil guy, who did terrible things to people and was at this nexus of the global ruling class. But yeah, he is gone or non-functional or whatever, and it's all still going on.
So like, yeah, like for a politician, like to be sort of rallying a populist rallying cry against the Epstein class. Like again, I can't say I am offended by or object strenuously to the invocation of that catchphrase. I think like it has a certain ring to it and a certain truth to it, but I can't help but feel it is essentially doing the work of not going directly at the capitalist ruling class writ large, not just like a couple of them who happen to be in emails with this asshole.
Yeah. I mean, part of when I got into the case, why I was interested in it, because I thought it could have like a political valence because of the connections to, the American political class. And now not just American, but the British. We didn't even talk about it, like his connections to the British ruling class, which are, huge. Actually, hey up lovely, we are recording a podcast, I think tomorrow. We're going to get back in the game, Scroungers, and talk about that, go deep on all that. But part of me is a little like black pilled on the political effect of it anymore. I think it's so co-opted. It has become like an alternative
because it
media.
can be applied to like any pseudo populist political point of view. It can be like used as a cudgel by things that are either like apolitical, anti-political, or quite frankly like outright reactionary and fascist. And if it's this omni tool for everyone who's mad at like the people in charge, them or whatever, then really the politics of it becomes totally neutered and neutralized. If it's everyone's catch-all for why things are fucked up and wrong.
Yeah, and people don't like do the things you hope they'll do with knowledge. Like, I used to think if everything came out about this case, people would draw the appropriate conclusions, which are my conclusions. But a lot of people draw completely contradictory conclusions. Like you said, everybody has figured out how to use Epstein. He's almost like no longer politically potent, because everyone can point this way or that using him because everyone in the, the political class can, because no one is really operating in good faith with him. which is why I'd hope for there to be, here maybe a parliamentary commission. There's going to be one in Norway. I think maybe if, you have these forums where there are people who maybe I am more politically like sympathetic to who are driving, these conclusions, will hopefully not weaponize them. Though, of course, it's difficult not to because they're such a weapon. But in any event, the facts will come out. I'm not sure, like, the facts coming out, how much that means for things anymore, but I still think it's good that they come out.
If anything productive is to happen, at least in terms of justice or accountability, you would have to start there. And you'd have to assume that that's a good thing that had to have happened, even if you are perhaps take a jaundiced view of the larger picture in terms of like this idea that if the people just knew the truth, then things would change. Well, but things can't change until until anyone knows the truth or until the truth is established in any kind of official way, right?
Yeah, it's like the first thing the Soviet government did when they took power is they published all the diplomatic cables or, all the classified documents of the Tsar, supposedly. I've always liked that idea,
just get it out there.
Yeah, I don't know if I believe in like knowledge is power, but I do think it can be,
Marlon, let's leave it there for today. I want to thank you for your time and for joining us on today's show. If you have any links that you'd like us to have in the episode description, please send in the chat or via email, and we'll be happy to put those in the episode description.